Hello everyone and welcome to the Vortex, where lies and falsehoods are trapped and exposed. I'm Michael Voris. Just before we begin today, if you could please remember my mom in your prayers. Today would have been her 89th birthday. Thank you, she'd have hated that. Roughly 1/4 of the U.S. population identifies as evangelical. That translates to about 80 million people. Evangelicals are not their own Protestant denomination, but rather a movement within Protestantism overall. As such, it draws on various denominations for its support. Evangelicalism has deep roots in America and worked to transform society in different eras, notably compromising the backbone of the abolitionist movement, which of course the Civil War finally solved. Evangelicals became notably political as big cultural moral changes began developing in the late 1950s and especially the 60s and moving forward. They were the main ingredient, for example, in Jerry Falwell's moral majority, helping Ronald Reagan twice into the White House. Since the 1990s, however, their political clout has somewhat waned, and by the time we arrived at the 21st century, that so-called Christian right had splintered to the point where a portion of those calling themselves evangelicals also identify as progressives. However, despite the waning influence over political policy, there's still a strong presence in the theological cultural sphere. Evangelicalism has a number of core holdings which include, as the name implies, evangelizing, but also the inerrancy of Scripture, as well as the need to be born again. These terms and labels are really nothing more than Martin Luther's original sola scriptura and sola fides, Scripture alone, as the authority, as well as simply believing, just faith, as the only required response. What supporters, however, fail to realize is that building a religion on those premises, just those premises, is doomed to failure, not only as a religion, but ultimately as a nation. The idea that Scripture, the Bible, is its own authority is beyond spiritually insane. It's destructive. It's not only interesting, but also important to note that not a single book in the Bible itself claims to be inspired by God. The closest thing, anything, that ever gets to that is when St. Paul says all Scripture is inspired, but when he wrote that, he was talking about the Old Testament. And moreover, he hadn't even finished writing his own letters, and a good portion of the New Testament hadn't even been written yet. How can his passage about inspiration be laid over parts of the Bible that didn't even exist yet? Nor did he know or would he think that they would exist when he wrote that line. The answer is, it can't. In order for followers of Christ to say all Scripture is inspired, there has to be a definitive authority to declare that St. Paul's writings are inspired, because he never said his writings were inspired. That authority is the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church alone. Yet, here's the problem. Only a few Protestants accept that on its face, and the few who do so kind of grudgingly, and then they quickly pass on from it. And yet this is the key, the main point to Christian theology, from which falls morality and ultimately the life of a nation, for a nation does rise or fall on its moral code. If the authority of the Catholic Church, not individual leaders here or there, but the teaching authority, the magisterium of the Church is denied or ignored, then you have theological chaos. That theological chaos, sooner or later, translates into social and political chaos, which is what we see playing out right now. Drag queen story hours, for example, have a direct line straight back to Martin Luther, as does every social and political evil afflicting the modern world. Protestantism, simply put, allows each man to decide for himself what is right and what is wrong, what Scripture means, what it doesn't, who Jesus is, and who he isn't. Despite all the good intentions and well-meaning on the part of the evangelical movement within Protestantism, in the end, it will fail because at its core, it is incomplete. It does not have the stuff of being able to withstand the assaults of the left, of communism. The reason, ultimately, is why communism is the fullness of the lie against humanity, and Protestantism, of which evangelicalism is a movement within, rejects the fullness of truth about Christ, owing to individual interpretation. In short, it is philosophically flawed. It is a house divided against itself. Communism is never divided against itself on its march toward global domination. It is divided, obviously, against the truth, but certainly not within its own realm, within its own sandbox. As you look over social media, you see an abundance of preachers and systems and postings about this version of Christianity or that version of Christianity. Follow Jesus this way, follow him that way, sign up, get the app, join in, all of that. And for the record, there are scads more of these that are Protestant than Catholic. Not surprising in a Protestant-dominated culture, but still important to know. They will rise or fall based on a combination of their content, how it acclimates to the current culture, and the personality of the preacher. What none of them will provide is the complete picture, because if they did, they'd be Catholic. So on social media and all those religion preaching sites and personalities, what you have is the old adage, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Catholicism has always been at a disadvantage in America. Despite the New World first being settled by French and Spanish Catholics in the 16th century, it was the arrival of the Puritan British and their eventual dominance from which the nation sprung. True, some of the original anti-Catholicism had waned a bit between the arrival of the Mayflower and the War of Independence 150 so years later, but not that much. Catholics in the U.S. were still marginalized and even despised up until the aftermath of World War II. It was only when they traded their faith for a place at the table of the dominant American culture of Protestantism that things got better for Catholics, materially and socially. By then, it was too late. Too many generations have passed. There are too few authentic Catholics to change the dominant Protestant ethos, and most importantly, beat back its consequences of atheism and put the nation on a path to true righteousness. Still, it is curious how few authentic Catholics, aside from the heretical ones, there are who are actually in the fight on social media. Yes, there are small efforts here and there by good Catholics, and they certainly are praiseworthy, absolutely good for you guys, and even to be lauded. But for the most part, most Catholic attempts in the land of social media are almost indistinguishable from Protestant efforts. The internet, social media, is where all the ideas and opinions are clashing and rubbing up against each other these days and forming the basis for some kind of counterattack against the communist left. It's too bad there are very few organized Catholic efforts, and even more sad that what few individual Catholic voices are present are relatively weak. For example, how has erroneous Protestant theology helped accelerate the decline of the nation? Well, here's an example. The acceptance of divorce and contraception, first embraced by Protestantism beginning about 100 years ago, and then eventually by many Catholics, has wiped out any notion of family. The destruction of the traditional family has given rise to a massive welfare state run by the government, the communists, which is now used to pummel the last remaining holdouts of any true understanding of Christianity. When a nation walks away from truth, it's only a matter of time. It's not enough to make nice with Protestantism. It's a heresy. And those individual Protestants who are of goodwill but simply don't know the reality, they must be taught the truth. They must be taught that reality. Chaos is in control politically because chaos is in control theologically. God love you. I'm Michael Voris.